metal drum sat abandoned near a construction site on an island in Tokyo Bay for nearly 3 months. Workers walked past it every day. No one gave it a second look. Inside that drum was a 17-year-old girl named Junko Furuta. What happened to her before she ended up there is one of the most disturbing crimes in modern Japanese history. It did not happen in a hidden place. It happened inside a normal house in a normal neighborhood, in a room just behind a door people passed every day. This is the story of Junko Furuta. Junko Furuta was an unremarkable, well-liked teenager. She was 17, a senior at Yashio Minami High School in Misato, Saitama Prefecture. She'd taken a part-time job at a plastic molding factory that October, saving up for a graduation trip with friends. She'd already accepted a job offer at an electronics retailer after she graduated. Friends said she dreamed of becoming an idol singer one day. According to several accounts, one of her classmates, a boy named Hiroshi Miyano, had developed feelings for her and was turned down. Miyano had dropped out of school that summer and became involved in low-level organized crime. Whether or not the rejection was the spark, what's certain is this. By November of 1988, Miyano and his friends had already been committing a string of assaults against women in their neighborhood. Junko Furuta was not their first target, she would be their last. The night of November 25, 1988. It was a Friday evening. Junko finished her shift at the factory and got on her bicycle. The streets were quiet, she had a short ride home. She never made it. Miyano and 16-year-old Shinji Minato were riding around Misato on motorcycles that night, looking for women to rob and assault. This wasn't impulsive, it was something they had already done before. They spotted Junko cycling along her usual route. On Miyano's orders, Minato rode up beside her and kicked her clean off her bicycle, then fled the scene. Junko hit the ground, confused and shaken. Before she could process what had happened, a second figure appeared, calm, concerned, apparently just passing by. It was Miyano, pretending he'd witnessed the attack by coincidence. He helped her up. He offered to walk her home. She accepted. That decision, made in a moment of fear, would cost Junko everything. Miyano didn't take her home. He led her to a nearby warehouse where the mask came off. He told her he was a Yakuza member. He told her he would spare her only if she did exactly as he said. Then he raped her. That night, he took her by taxi to a hotel in Adachi and raped her again. Afterward, he called Minato's house to brag to his friend Joe Agura about what he'd done. Agura's response was immediate: don't let her leave. In the early hours of November 26th, Miyano brought Junko to a park near the hotel, where Agura, Minato, and a fourth boy, 17-year-old Yasushi Watanabe, were waiting. They told her they knew where her family lived. They told her the Yakuza would kill them if she tried to run. Then Minato agreed to let the group confine her in a room on the second floor of his family's house in Adachi, Tokyo, for the explicit purpose of continuing to rape her. What followed has been documented in extraordinary, harrowing detail through Tokyo District Court records. It would last 40 days. Minato's parents lived in that house. At first, the boys told them Junko was a girlfriend. The parents weren't convinced, but for a while they went along with it, forcing Junko to play the part whenever they were nearby. Eventually, the pretense fell apart entirely once it became clear Minato's parents weren't going to call the police. Why didn't they? According to their own later statements, they were afraid of their son. Minato had become increasingly violent toward his own family, and the household had learned to avoid provoking him. 2 days after Junko vanished, on November 27th, her parents reported her missing to the police. To keep the investigation from going anywhere, her captors forced her to call her own mother 3 separate times and tell her she'd run away and was safe with friends. Her mother had no way of knowing her daughter was a few kilometers away, in a locked room, being raped by a rotating group of teenagers. What happened inside that room over the following weeks is laid out in unflinching detail in the Tokyo District Court's judgment. On the night of November 28th, Miyano and the others, joined by 2 more 16-year-olds, Tetsuo Nakamura and Koichi Ahara, gang-raped Junko. Afterward, Miyano shaved her pubic hair with a razor and burned the area with a lit match. In early December, after a failed escape attempt, they punished her by repeatedly punching her in the face and burning her ankles with a lighter. They forced her to dance naked to music. They forced her to masturbate in front of them. They made her stand on the balcony, barely dressed, in the middle of winter. They inserted objects into her body, a metal rod, a glass bottle. They forced her to drink alcohol, milk, and water in large quantities, smoke 2 cigarettes simultaneously, and inhale paint thinner fumes. In mid-December, the group beat her again, this time because Miyano claimed he'd stepped in a puddle of her urine. He burned her thighs and hands with lighter fluid afterward. It was around this point, according to the court record, that Junko, unable to withstand the repeated assaults any longer, began begging her captors to kill her. The abuse only escalated from there. By the end of December, she was severely malnourished, fed only small amounts of food and eventually only milk. Her injuries left her unable to walk to the bathroom downstairs. She was confined to the floor of the room, too weak to move. Her face had swollen beyond recognition. Her wounds had begun to smell. Outside that house, Japan was getting ready for the new year. Inside, a 17-year-old girl who had once dreamed of becoming a singer was lying on a floor, unable to stand. On the night of January 3, 1989, Hiroshi Miyano lost money playing mahjong. The next day, he decided to take it out on Junko. He lit a candle and dripped hot wax onto her face. He placed 2 shortened candles directly on her eyelids. He forced her to drink her own urine. When she was lifted and kicked, she fell onto a stereo unit and began convulsing. The group, wearing plastic bags over their hands to avoid getting blood on themselves, beat her with their fists and with an iron exercise ball, dropping it onto her abdomen multiple times. Then Miyano poured lighter fluid over her body and set her on fire. She made weak attempts to put the flames out, then she stopped moving entirely. The assault lasted roughly 2 hours. Junko Furuta died at 10 a.m. on January 4, 1989. She was 17 years old. Less than 24 hours later, Minato's brother called to say Junko appeared to be dead. Afraid of what they'd be facing, the group wrapped her body in a blanket, placed it inside a large travel bag, and then sealed that bag inside a metal drum filled with wet concrete. That evening, they drove to a vacant lot near a construction site on the island of Wakasu, in Kodo, Tokyo, and left the drum there among the building materials. It would sit there for nearly 3 months. How they were caught. In early 1989, Miyano and Agura were arrested, but not for Junko. They were taken in for kidnapping and gang raping a different 19-year-old woman the group had abducted back in December, while Junko was still alive in that house. During Miyano's interrogation, police mentioned they were investigating an open murder case. Miyano mistakenly believed Agura had already confessed to Junko's killing and that police already knew, so he told them exactly where to find her body. The detectives questioning him were confused. They'd been asking about an unrelated case entirely. Miyano had, without meaning to, turned himself in for a crime they didn't even know to ask about. The drum was recovered from the Wakasu site on March 29, 1989. Junko was identified through her fingerprints. Minato, Watanabe, Minato's brother, Nakamura, and Ihara were all arrested in the days that followed. The trial. Because all 4 main perpetrators were legally juveniles under the age of 20, Japanese law sealed their identities from the public. The weekly tabloid Shuken Bunshin broke that protection deliberately, publishing their real names and arguing that the severity of the crime outweighed their right to anonymity. In July 1990, the Tokyo District Court found all 4 guilty of abduction for sexual assault, confinement, rape, assault, murder, and abandonment of a corpse. All 4 appealed. In July 1991, the Tokyo High Court increased 3 of the sentences. Hiroshi Miyano, originally 17 years, increased to 20 years. This was the longest sentence available in Japan short of life imprisonment, and the prosecution had actually sought a life sentence for him specifically. During the trial, a court-ordered psychological evaluation found Miyano had a learning disability that, in the court's words, did not impair his brain function, but delayed his emotional development. His parents sold their family home and paid Junko's parents yen 50 million, roughly $850,000 today, in compensation, which his defense presented as a mitigating factor. Joe Agura, sentenced to 5 to 10 years, released in 1999. Shinji Minato, originally 5 to 6 years, increased to 5 to 9 years, released in 1998. Yasushi Watanabe, originally 3 to 4 years, increased to 5 to 7 years. He appealed all the way to the Supreme Court of Japan and lost in 1992, released in 1996. Nakamura and Ihara, the 2 additional teenagers who raped Junko but weren't involved in her death, were released from juvenile detention by 2000. The public response was immediate outrage. The The Tokyo Metropolitan Police and the courts were flooded with letters and calls demanding harsher punishment, some calling for the death penalty. Legal commentators pointed to a separate case from the same year, the Nagoya couple murder, where a 19-year-old received a death sentence for killing 2 people, as proof the system was inconsistent. A law professor at Nihon University later explained that under Japanese sentencing precedent, the death penalty is rarely applied to cases with only one victim, and that, unlike the Nagoya case, Junko's murder lacked clear premeditation, which weighed heavily under the law. Interestingly, when the Asahi Shimbun newspaper surveyed legal professionals, a majority actually said the sentences were appropriate given existing precedent, a finding that did little to calm public anger. None of the 4 spent the rest of their lives in prison. Hiroshi Miyano was released in 2009 and changed his surname to Yokohama. He reportedly boasted about his Yakuza ties and got involved in pyramid schemes. In 2013, he was arrested on suspicion of bank fraud and running scam phone calls, but he stayed silent throughout questioning and was never charged. Joe Aguirre, released in 1999, changed his name to Kamisaku and briefly built something resembling a normal life, an IT job, a marriage to a Chinese woman, a move to Chiba Prefecture. It didn't last. He divorced, lost his job once his past became public knowledge, and slid back into Yakuza circles. In 2004, he was arrested again, this time for abducting and assaulting a 27-year-old man he believed was involved with his girlfriend, shoving him into a car trunk and beating him for 4 hours at his mother's bar. He served 4 more years. After his final release in 2009, he lived alone on welfare in an apartment in Saitama. On July 16, 2022, while on psychiatric medication, he collapsed in his bathroom, got his head trapped between the toilet and the wall, and choked on his own vomit. He was 51. Shinji Minato was released in 1998, moved in with his mother. In 2018, by then unemployed, he was arrested again, this time for striking a man with a metal baton and slashing his neck with a knife during a dispute over a parking spot in Kawaguchi, Saitama. He was sentenced in 2019 to a 1.5 years in prison, suspended with 3 years probation. Yasushi Watanabe, released in 1996, lived quietly with his mother in Tokyo. By 2005, he had developed a neurodegenerative disease and couldn't afford treatment for it. He died in May 2021 at 49 years old. Of the 4, only Aguirre is dead by something resembling consequence. The other 3 lived ordinary, if diminished, lives after release, one of them committing further violence, one disappearing into illness and poverty, one slipping quietly back into the world that made him. Junko Furuta's funeral was held on April 2, 1989. One of her classmates delivered a eulogy written by her peers, thanking her for the gentleness she'd shown them and promising that her death would not be in vain. Her school's principal attended in person and brought her diploma. Because of it, all 47 students in her class were able to graduate together. Her future employer, the electronics retailer that had hired her for after graduation, brought the uniform she would have worn. It was placed inside her casket. The case forced a national reckoning in Japan over how the justice system treats juvenile offenders, fueling years of public debate that, alongside other cases, eventually contributed to reforms lowering the age of adult criminal responsibility. But the law can only address what happens after the fact. It can't answer the question that still lingers over this case. How does abuse like this continue in an ordinary house for 40 days without anyone outside that room stopping it? Junko Furuta spent those 40 days a few kilometers from a family that loved her, filing a missing person report, waiting by the phone for any sign she was safe. She was 17 years old, and she never made it home.